Harold and the Purple Crayon is technically a movie? This is hands down the most mediocre, stereotypical, and middle-of-the-road movie that I've covered on this channel. What's crazy is that Harold and the Purple Crayon has been in development since 1992. 32 years trying to get a Harold and the Purple Crayon film is hilarious to me. The author, Crockett Johnson, was a mentor to a man named Maurice Sendak, and he was set to be a producer through his production company, Wild Thing Productions. It got as close as casting, storyboards, and even starting animation work, but after a new company bought the rights, they scrapped it 2 months before it started filming. Which brings us to the version we finally got, starring professional adult man playing a child, Zachary Levi. Though Harold and the Purple Crayon isn't terrible, it is funny to me that the worst parts of this movie are all the scenes that involve Harold. So knowing all of that, let's get into it. The movie opens with narration in a cartoon style telling us that a young boy named Harold has a magic crayon. Anything he draws comes to life, and he's always getting into messes and making pies. He's also always making friends. Quite literally, he drew his friends Moose and Porcupine. We watch as Harold goes from a baby to a grown adult, and after he's all grown up, he starts to hear the narrator. One night, the narrator tells Harold that he drew him and gave him the crayon, and in a way, he's like his papa. Unfortunately for Harold, when he asks if he can meet him, the narrator tells Harold that he lives in the real world. So the next morning when Harold tries to talk to the narrator again, he's now disappeared, so he comes up with the big plan to visit the real world. His friend Moose goes in after him, but Porcupine gets a little held up so we can have a pointless side plot about all the things she gets up to in the real world. Oh, and when Porcupine and Moose come over into the real world, they get transformed into humans. Now that he's in the real world, whenever Harold draws with the crayon, the drawing then becomes a real world version of whatever he drew. We are then introduced to Zooey Deschanel's character, Terry, as she's driving her kid Mel to a school event. Harold and Moose cut her off on their adorable tandem bike, and she ends up hitting them before she runs off the road and pops her tire. Using the magic crayon, Harold makes Terry a new tire, and she doesn't question how these two guys on a bike magically make a tire that fits her car perfectly, and it's purple. She offers to give them a ride and asks where they want to go, and because neither Moose or Harold know what they're doing, they end up coming across like crazy people. Mel decides that these guys are super cool, so he uses his dead dad's words against his mom so it'll convince her to let them stay with them. What a great kid. We randomly cut to a pair of detectives talking to an old guy before they walk away, and the lead detective tells his rookie partner that rule number 1 is to always humor the crazies. That night, Mel and Harold make a deal to help each other by Mel helping Harold find his dad, aka the narrator, and Harold agreeing to help his mom be happy. Then Harold shows Mel the magic crayon, and Mel draws a poisonous spider fly that then eats a butterfly and chases after them. We then cut to Porcupine's side plot as she stumbles through the street and comes across a random house. She breaks in, steals a jacket, and then eats some cake on the counter before a man yells at her that he called the cops. Her whole side plot is just stumbling around getting into trouble, so the detectives will eventually catch up to her for a big third act huzzah moment. Terry wakes up the next morning to the terrifying spider fly in her face, which someone should just kill. Just saying, it's gross and horrifying and I hate it. She goes outside to find Harold, Mel, and Moose eating pies, and also that her house is purple now. To which again, she doesn't question how this random man who had nowhere to stay was only there that night, and yet somehow he was able to paint her entire house overnight while leaving zero evidence and also not having purple paint. Mel takes Harold and Moose to the library to help them find the narrator. The single best thing about this movie is Gary, the head librarian. And when we meet him, he is reading the book he wrote to pretty much no one. Gary also has a massive crush on Terry and mistakenly believes that this man-child is sleeping with her. This is one of a few sex jokes that this kids movie includes, and I know it's so the parents can have something to laugh at, but it never feels right to me. Harold asks Gary for help, but since he doesn't know anything about the narrator, it ends up being a complete waste of time. And I will say, I love Jermaine Clement, and him as the librarian is just really nice.
Right. What's your dad's name?
I know he's an old man, and I know that he's in the real world.
Okay. Old man, planet Earth, and that brings up 500 million people.
The plan that Harold comes up with is to draw a plane and write the narrator a message in the sky. So as Gary is getting rejected by a publisher for the book he wrote, Harold draws the plane and Gary sees it and realizes what's going on. When they get up in the sky, Mel tells Harold that he can't give out his number to strangers, so instead they agree to write Terry's phone number in the sky. The message they write tells old men to call, so in a very unfunny montage, Terry gets a bunch of calls from old guys. After they write Terry's number in the sky, they parachute down to Mel's school and part ways. At school, Mel gets bullied and has to go to the principal's office after he elbows a kid in the nose by accident. To no one's surprise, Terry gets in trouble for all the phone calls she keeps getting at work, and her weirdo boss tells her that this is her last warning. Which is great timing because Harold and Moose just show up at Terry's work and she finds them on the display chairs eating cheese balls. Mel's principal calls her and tells her that he has to go home, so she leaves the rest of her shift in the hands of Dumb and Dumber. 6 minutes into stocking shelves, they just give up and wander out to the store floor to get up to more nonsense. Moose peacefully sits and listens to moose sounds, while Harold ignores the 2 brain cells he has and makes everyone's life a living hell. He adds springs to an old lady's shoes, draws a real-life puma for a man looking at shoes, and adds real helicopter blades to a little kid's ride. This results in the entire store getting wrecked, and this mom holding onto the helicopter her tiny son is piloting. She definitely has severe PTSD now. Since the entire store is now completely wrecked, Terry gets blamed and fired. She mainly gets fired because Harold admits he's impulsive and blabs about how Terry hates her job in front of her boss. I guess it doesn't really matter because Terry ends up not caring even though she just lost her only source of income as a single mom with a kid. In this economy, I'd be a little bit more worried if I was her. The 4 go out for a walk and Harold draws a piano when Terry isn't looking so she can play because that's her true love in life. But as soon as she starts, we cut to the same detectives from earlier as they're now looking for Harold and Moose because of the ruckus they caused at the store. Then we cut back to Porcupine as she just causes issues for waiters at a local restaurant, as if food industry workers don't have it hard enough with Karen slapping employees. Damn! When we get back to Terry, she's finishing her song as she's now gathered a giant audience. Gary also shows up, and after he hits on Terry, he tells Harold he knows who his dad is. So Harold and Moose go off with Gary, and he shows them the book that they come from. He then tells them that the reason they came to life is because the Purple Crayon is made from the most mysterious, powerful, extraordinary stuff on Earth: imagination.
Step back, I think I'm gonna vomit!
Porcupine then shows up to where Harold and Moose are, and they reunite briefly before the detectives tackle everyone and arrest them. Now in jail and without the crayon, Harold comes up with his one and only good idea in the movie and forms a plan. While a guard is putting another person in the cell, Moose sneaks out to grab the crayon and tosses it to Porcupine. Harold draws a lock on the cell and then draws a wrecking ball to escape the police station. But I'm realizing now his plan was to have Moose sneak out and just grab it.
Not a great plan.
Mel, on the other hand, gets shoved in a closet by the bullies from earlier, and using a piece of the crayon he has, he draws an eagle alligator thing? The poor principal gets tail whipped into what I can only assume is a coma, or at the very least, hip replacement surgery. Harold and the gang show up just as Mel is running outside, and they take Mel with them because they know where the author now lives. All the characters start to come together as Gary spots the gang driving on the wrong side of the road, and the school calls to tell Terry that Mel ran away, and probably that his principal is dead. When Harold gets to the author's house, he learns that he actually passed away, and his house is now a museum. Terry shows up and takes Mel away and yells at Harold to stay away because every time he's around, everything goes wrong, which is 100% true. This crushes Harold's spirit and imagination, which causes all the drawings to disappear, which includes Moose and Porcupine. It also causes the tire he drew for Terry to vanish, which again, she doesn't think it's weird that her tire just vanished off her car for no reason. Gary spots Harold and gives him a ride, and they pass right by Mel, who sees Harold in Gary's passenger seat. He pleads with his mom to believe him, but of course she doesn't, so later he sneaks out of his room and goes off to find Harold. Gary's big plan is to convince Harold to give him the crayon so he can make his fantasy world from the book he wrote come to life. He also chains Harold to a wall in the library, and when Mel shows up, Gary just chains him up too. So Gary goes off on an evil revenge quest, Terry discovers that Mel snuck out, and Harold and Mel have a heart-to-heart. Using a piece of the crayon, Mel not only escapes the library, but also refuels Harold's imagination meter. With all the imagination power coming back, Terry sees the paint on her house return, which makes things start to click a little bit for her. Harold and Mel intercept Gary, and during their standoff, we get a very in-your-face penis joke.
Mine's bigger.
No, don't do that. 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 You ain't gotta do that. You ain't gotta do that.
The two men have a drawing battle, which includes giant fans blowing Gary back, Gary hurtling giant boulders at Harold, and it ending when Harold uses a giant slinky to win. Gary must have been in the Marine Corps because he straight up eats the crayon. I really want to know what the flavor is. Personally, I think the blue ones taste the best, but that's just me. So by eating the crayon, Gary has now absorbed the powers, just as Terry finds Mel and Harold at the fight. Then Gary becomes an all-out evil sorcerer and opens up the ground with lava as Harry Boy loses his crayon. Lucky for everyone, the weird eagle alligator thingy that Mel drew back at the school flies in to save the day. Just kidding, it immediately gets taken down and Gary continues to go full psycho wizard. The real saving grace appears in the form of Moose and Porcupine arriving to help Harold find the crayon he lost and stop Gary. Because of friendship, the whole gang pitches in to get Gary to cough up the crayon. In the spirit of it being a kids movie, Harold comforts Gary and draws a teleporter to his fantasy world for him to live in. The Eagle Gator burns the door, leaving Gary in his fantasy world forever. After that, everyone else goes back to the author's house to go through the museum and learn more about what they are and who he was. Harold gets his wish as Crockett Johnson left a real-life note for his fictional character Harold, explaining why he made him. Crockett wanted people to be inspired by the imagination of Harold to live their lives the same way he did in the books. Before he goes back to his own world, Mel gives him a snack for the trip, rainbow crayons, and the movie ends with Harold going back to the book world. I guess the only question I have after this movie is, why? Is Hollywood desperate for movies that they turn anything into any movie starring anyone? Yes. The answer is always yes. This is such a nothing movie because it doesn't try to do anything interesting or engaging with the crayon. I was definitely expecting Harold to use the crayon more and there be more use for it in the real world, but he only uses it a handful of times. He draws ice cream, paints a house, makes an airplane, and does a few other things, but mostly it felt like the crayon was underused. Maybe I was expecting more and my hopes were a little high, and that's why it just becomes a letdown for me, but overall I just felt unsatisfied with the crayon department. At least the final draw fight is cool, and that's where the crayon is explored the most, and if it wasn't so weighed down in Harold being a doofus, it would probably be a lot better. Also, what was the thinking behind casting Zachary Levi to play the very famous and always a baby character of Harold? You could argue it's a star power thing, but I'd argue back that he's not a very big star. Can you say you recognize any of these other Zachary Levi movies that have come out in the last decade, minus Shazam? We have entered a new wave of kid actors, and though some aren't great, I would say there are a lot of really good ones out there. I just don't like when grown men play characters that are either a child trapped in an adult's body or an actual adult who just never learned to grow up. Honestly, this would have been better as a story about Crockett Johnson and how he created the character instead. You could very easily turn this into something for kids and adults, as it teaches about all ages keeping their imagination or something. I mean, the best and funniest parts are the moments with Gary the librarian. Jermaine Clement is hands down the best part of this movie because he's actually funny and his comedic timing is incredible. I'm pretty sure the only time I laughed was when he was on screen, especially this moment he has with the kid in the library.
What? Hey!
Quiet, please. This is a library.
I will give Harold and the Purple Crayon some praise though, because I had a couple things I enjoyed. For starters, I love Little Rel Howery in this movie because I love him in everything. I fell in love with him after I saw Get Out, where he absolutely crushed it as the best friend. He also played a more serious character in Vacation Friends, where John Cena is the crazy one. Also a fun watch. And special thanks to this movie for not having Harold and Terry be romantic in the end. It would have been super fucking weird since, again, Harold feels like a child, even though he is technically sorta kinda an adult. Even though the scenes with the detectives kind of made me laugh, I'm not really sure why they're in this movie or if they're even needed. The detectives have maybe 3 scenes where they're chasing everyone, and then after they put the gang in jail, we never see them again. It's similar to Porcupine's side plot. It doesn't really go anywhere, and it has no effect on the overall plot of what's going on. But hey, you gotta pad the runtime when there's not much going on in the first place. But if I'm being honest, this is one you can definitely skip and is a whole lot of nothing. So Harold and the Purple Crayon snack are going into just plain garbage. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this, don't forget to check out my video on the movie The Emoji Movie, a just plain garbage type of film. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below what movie you'd like to see me cover in the future.